By the time of the previous episode, much had already been exposed and reported. We thought we had hit rock bottom. But then Dvorkin knocked from below, and this time he wasn't alone. I warned earlier that we had yet to learn of many crimes committed by members of Dvorkin's anti-cult network with its extremist terrorist ideology, and that what would surface would shock us. Recently, David Jahl, one of Czech independent investigative journalists, released a shocking documentary, Victims of Jakub Jahl in Africa, exposing criminal activities of one of the key agents of Dvorkin's anti-cult network. Their investigation targeted Jakub Jahl, the face of anti-cultism in the Czech Republic. His name was already mentioned in my earlier episodes. Not much time has passed, but the film has already shaken all of Czech Republic and Slovakia, and even spread widely abroad in different languages. Thousands of reposts, comments, feedback from people in many languages, and an all-encompassing public outrage. How, after everything Jakub Jahl did during his so-called humanitarian mission in Africa, is he still at large? The most horrifying thing is that this predator, as the filmmakers called him, is still walking the same streets as our children in the Czech Republic. He is someone's neighbor and someone's acquaintance. What's more, mass media invite him as a cult expert, and well-known bloggers openly promote his activities. Following in the footsteps of his Russian leader Alexander Dvorkin, Jahl created around himself a toxic community where everyone writes sycophantic praise to this pedophile. And any stigmatizing information that Jahl, as an expert, writes about organizations or individuals, his cult followers respond with attack, like Pavlov's best-trained dogs. To be honest, after watching David Jahl's documentary, when you read justifying comments under social media posts of this maniac Jahl, it makes you want to vomit. What sane person would defend a sadist who, gratifying his manic urges, raped and slashed a little girl with a knife? Or forced little boys to defecate directly into his mouth? Would a person of sound mind justify such monstrous acts against innocent kids? What must be in a person's head to accuse of forgery a little child who should have had a happy childhood and serenely joyful mood? But instead, he picks up Jahl's photo with trembling hands and, stammering, tries to tell what happened to him. I no longer even know what shocks me and churns my stomach more. The fact that Alexander Dvorkin, the leader of the extremist network whose ideology and methods Jahl shares, is a coprophile and a pedophile who forces his perversions not only on students, many of whom, by all accounts, are likely under 18, but also on clergy and, as I've shown in previous videos, on members of law enforcement, the judiciary, and even government officials. Or the fact that Jakub Jahl, a man who has long been associated with reoccurring and serious suspicions of pathological behavior, including sexual deviance, pedophilia, and coprophilia, contact the minors and disturbing manifestations of a disturbed psyche, was able to use participation in a humanitarian mission in Africa in a way that, given all the evidence and testimonies, looks like a cover for his perverted interests, and yet he still has access to mass media and the public information space. Sometimes, Information about Dvorkin sounds absurd. Realizing that this man, almost 70 years old, seemingly of venerable age and, supposedly, wisdom, invented an initiation rite into his sect, involving the eating of feces. Only one thought comes to mind. The old man has completely lost his mind. That's why people in social media mockingly give Dvorkin his well-earned and much-desired title, Shit Grandpa. But personally, analyzing all the available information, as I've said before, I come to a conclusion that this is an incredible level of genius to merge his manic perversions with a system of attaining total power. Because, let me repeat, anyone who goes through Dvorkin's feces initiation into his sect, or, to call things by their proper names, anyone who eats Dvorkin shit gains money, status, power, and protection, but becomes a lifelong prisoner of his fecal anti-cult structure. Yet, returning to his international sectarian follower Jakub Jahl, it's hard to call this absurd. There's no room for jokes, laughter, or memes here. Although Jahl himself clearly enjoyed the taste, as he happily posted people's creative jokes about himself on his blog, I still cannot get out of my head the eyes of those children who summoned all their courage and, through fear and enormous internal turmoil, spoke the truth about the white man who supposedly came to help them, but in fact beat them, injected them with unknown substances, raped and abused them. I think about what kind of courage it must have taken for those kids to speak these horrific truths out loud. Meanwhile, how does Jakub Jahl himself react to the release of the documentary where his victims openly describe his crimes? Evidently, as one of the fondest memories of his time in Africa, on his Instagram page, he posted a clip from the film featuring a child he had forced to defecate directly into his mouth and captioned a post, "This is real violence against children, forcing them to read a script of absurd accusations against me. Poor child." Poor child? Violence against children? Yes, Jakub, the child really is poor because of your disgusting coprophilic mouth. And who can talk about violence against children better than you, indeed? But fine, Jahl's mind is already rotted by fecal intoxication. What else can you expect? But the people supporting his post, what about you? Whom are you supporting? Let's watch that clip from the documentary again. It's interesting, isn't it, why this anti-cult expert posted that clip, but cropped out the most important part. Look closely. You can see that the sheet of paper the journalist holds out to the boy has no text, but clearly shows a printed photo of Jahl himself. Why, Jakub? Was that part too inconvenient? Perhaps it would have said too much to your obedient fanatics, wouldn't it? You, those watching me now, surely many of you have children, have daughters. So I'm asking you now, can you imagine that happening to your daughter? Can you imagine your 10-year-old daughter being in a situation where she's attacked by a deranged anti-cultist who wants to abuse her body and forever cripple her psyche? I'm a father, and my heart ached with unbearable pain when I heard about Rosie's abuse, and how painful it was to hear that after the incident, she was left all alone, without family, without support, literally on the street. It's good there are kind people in the world, and there were those who could at least provide her with a night's lodging. But Rosie had to work hard, and she is still surviving. While Jakub Jahl, her rapist, lives happily, laughing at her testimony and continuing to scam people out of money, profiteering from the same thing, only now in the Czech Republic, from destroying other people's lives under the guise of anti-cult activities. Her story is not just a testimony, it's a cry for help, to which the world must respond because Jakub Jahl isn't the only one. Dvorkin's entire anti-cult network, with which he is linked by a single extremist and terrorist ideology, has gathered obvious psychopaths, maniacs, and sadists. They are all like that. Would a normal, mentally healthy person share this kind of ideology? Rape children, beat them, or cut them? Would a sane person enjoy inflicting pain and suffering on others? Revel in destruction of other people's destinies? Make videos about it? Broadcast them openly? And boast as the greatest victory that they have exposed a sect? I have another simple question. After his crimes in Tanzania, this maniac and sadist Jahl returned to his native country, the Czech Republic. Yet do you think he stopped after what he had done in Africa? Based on all the testimonies of the people presented in David Ball's documentary, his actions fit the behavioral profile of a pedophile. Empirical studies show that a pedophile who has already committed contact violence against a child has a psychological profile with a deficit of self-control and cognitive distortions, which indicates an established pattern of behavior. Such profiles have a high risk of abuse reoccurrence. If a pedophile has committed repeated contact abuse of a child, the risk that he will continue to do so in the future remains extremely high. Or, simply put, a pedophile cannot deny himself this pleasure. Now, I have the following question. How can you sleep easy when someone like Jahl walks the same streets as you and me and our children, or lives in a house next door to yours? Is there any guarantee that he won't attack someone again or rape our children if he has already done it to African kids? Is it normal that he is still part of society and moreover has open access to public media space? After all, everyone knows perfectly well that maniacs who committed a series of terrible crimes will never stop. And here comes another, much more terrible question. How many young children disappear without a trace every year in our country, the Czech Republic, where this maniac and sadist Jahl resides? Another question. In Tanzania, he felt unpunished, and people were powerless. He could do whatever he wanted and wasn't held accountable. But here, in our country, he realizes that if he touches a child with a finger, he will be punished immediately. Hence, a natural question arises. Where do young children disappear to? And how does this sadist and maniac satisfy his needs, which he will never give up? Especially taking into account that his friend studies at the police academy, where he learns how to track down criminals, and therefore knows how to properly cover the traces of crime. Note that I'm not claiming that Jahl, this anti-cult expert, is committing such crimes here in the Czech Republic. I'm asking a question that simply arose logically, and who will answer it? Who has checked and compared the activities of anti-cultists, not only Jahl, with the number of disappeared children? How many of the anti-cult experts, fighters against sects, are there in our country? And how many followers do they have? Followers of that very sadist and maniac Jahl. Where do young children disappear without a trace, and why? Has anyone established correlations? I'm just asking a question. Recently, there has been a growing number of cases when anti-cult representatives give lectures in educational and children's institutions, at festivals, and participate in podcasts, where they use manipulation methods to introduce Nazi ideology of superiority to a wide audience, including kids. Let me remind you that Jakub Jahl, after he returned from Africa, studied at the Faculty of Religious Studies, and then changed his faculty and is now studying pedagogy at Charles University. Can you imagine such a thing? That a pedophile, a sadist, and a maniac would be a teacher in your child's school, and one day would walk into your daughter's or son's classroom? Can you have peace of mind that they will come home safely? After all, what we saw in the investigative documentary about Jakub Jahl is only part of the crimes he committed. Many witnesses have yet to come forward with their stories, and that's just in Africa. But how many more children could he have raped and maimed here in the Czech Republic? That region of Tanzania was actually a small, close-knit community where everyone knows each other, and he was there in plain sight. Why did he come back to the Czech Republic in such a hurry? Because here in Europe, in the crowd and rush of big cities, his activities are not so visible. He returned to Europe to hide his criminal nature behind the anti-cult activities and to continue practicing his sadistic urges. What you've seen in the documentary is an example of implementation of the ideology that the entire anti-cult network spreads under the guise of fighting against cults and sects. An ideology created in the Moscow office of Alexander Dvorkin, an old but, alas, extremely active psychopath whose fetish has long been known. Humiliation, cruelty, and total submission within the sect through initiation rituals involving the eating of feces. It was from his mouth 30 years ago that the stench of ideological fesism started. And today, it pollutes everyone involved in the fight against sects. His unofficial regalia should be well known to you if you have watched my previous videos. He's a man with a confirmed mental disorder and, according to open source evidence, a drug addict, a pedophile, and most disgusting of all, a man who has a predilection for a sexual perversion known as coprophilia. Simply put, he gets a sexual pleasure from eating his partner's feces or having his partner eat his feces. Just like Jakub Jahl and many of his other adherents. But next to Dvorkin and outside Russia is his entire menagerie. In Ukraine, it is Irina Krymenovska, a journalist, the same one Jakub Jahl likes to refer to in his videos. She's a dog lover, but not in the sense that normal people love dogs. Her hobby is to give dogs remedies, as she herself says, after which they die painfully, emitting wailing moans, which Krymenovska calls symphony. Jahl in Tanzania was also involved in poisoning dogs. According to eyewitnesses, Joseph, who described in the documentary how They once found a huge number of dead dogs in the city, and they knew it was Jakub who had done that. Today, however, Kremenovska is the front-runner for fighting against cults and sects in Ukraine. She has shifted from bullying dogs to people. She acts as an expert in the media, publishes pseudoscientific articles, and, what's especially dangerous, closely cooperates with law enforcement agencies, promoting through them her fabricated conclusions regarding organizations that, according to the order of her Russian supervisor, need to be eliminated. While previously she enjoyed the agony of animals, now it's no longer enough for her. She needs a new symphony of pain, and this time the screams and groans of people comfort her ears. It is also worth recalling her associate in spreading the extremist and terrorist ideology of Dvorkin's network, Svyatogor. He's a dog hunter who, according to some sources, has killed 1,000 dogs. But just as in the case of Jahl, certain facts pop up in his biography that one cannot read without disgust. I quote from open sources in 2010 to 2012. Svyatogor liked to visit this orphanage and rented underage girls for sex, repaying with ridiculous amounts of money and food, while calling himself a benefactor and breadwinner. Have you noticed a pattern? Cruelty is always next to Dvorkin's ideology. Violence is next to the rhetoric of protecting society from scary cults. They come to society under the mask of defenders, but let's be honest. What kind of defenders are they if they are united not by compassion, but by cruelty, not by help, but by sadism? Why do all these people have so much in common? And why, every time, under the guise of fighting cults and sects, we find traces of violence against children, against animals, against society? And behind some of the fighters against cults and sects and greatest exposers, we find huge numbers of children's corpses. If someone still believes these are all coincidences, then let them answer this one question. Why hasn't a single representative of this network condemned the actions of Jakub Jahl and distanced themselves from him? Why have none of them questioned his right to be called an expert? Why is there silence instead of, even worse, support? None of them said, "We're against violence. We stand for the law." Because in fact, they all stand for their own cause, for power, for the ability to decide who can be dehumanized today and who can be destroyed tomorrow. Because they consider themselves a higher caste, while we, ordinary people, and our children, are a lower caste in their eyes, a tool to satisfy their sadistic needs. In this network, no one judges each other, and none of them hide because everyone has the same kind of skeletons in their closet. Some with the faces of children, some have dead animal collars, while others have pictures of themselves in front of fecal initiation. We're not talking about 3 or 4 mentally unstable people. This is an entire system, a distributed, disciplined, and coordinated system. If anyone else thinks that these are coincidences, let them think. How many coincidences do we need to start talking about a pattern? How many more of our children are supposed to disappear? How many more children have to be raped and murdered under the guise of a volunteer mission? How many dogs have to be killed, believers of various religions maimed, and lives ruined before you recognize that it is not an accident or coincidence? It's a pattern and a strategy. The most terrifying feature of the entire anti-cult network is its respectability. Outward and formal one. Almost none of its figures are recluses or madmen ranting in a town square with a megaphone. They are experts. They are invited into TV studios. They are published on news websites. They write reviews, give commentaries, and speak at academic conferences. Their words spark investigative reports, and their statements form a basis for court rulings. To put it simply, this is how the anti-cult network merges with the media space. We see the same faces appearing as experts, then as authors of articles, and then as invited guests on talk shows, all promoting the same destructive, Nazi-style rhetoric of superiority of some people over others, undermining every principle of democracy. And it all takes place with impunity, right out in the open. They have taken up key positions in the information space, and through these channels, they legitimize their ideology, creating an atmosphere of fear, intolerance, and segregation. Yes, formally, it doesn't appear to be a centralized structure with a single headquarters. But the fact that the same individuals are active in mass media, education, and anti-cult activities is too consistent to be a coincidence. Ideological coordination has already been traced and documented. Just as Nazism once used mass media to exert global influence, today's anti-cult network employs the same mechanisms to destroy, to stigmatize, and to sow enmity, hatred, and violence in society. Take the case of Jakub Jahl, activist, anti-cultist, child protector, and cult expert. But now, after the release of the documentary The Victims of Jakub Jahl in Africa, we know where the donations really went. Funds sent by kind, sincere people from the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and according to some sources, from other parts of Europe too, meant to help children. People he, in gratitude for their generosity, called stupid whites, who sent him money. People whom he and his anti-cult accomplices consider inferior stock. The money didn't go towards schools, medicine, or food. It funded his personal depravity, drugs, the covering up of his sexual crimes against minors, blackmail, and according to witness accounts, even elimination of inconvenient individuals. And then he's invited onto a very popular TV channel where he speaks about cults and the threat to democracy. Viewers do not realize that in front of them isn't an expert, but a product of the very same horrific machine of violence and sadism, a machine that viewers as taxpayers help finance. This is the core mechanism on which the anti-cult empire is built. The weapon of those who hide behind anti-cult activity isn't a knife or a gun. Their weapon is the information sphere, text, microphone, and camera, access to the public mind. If an organization or political figure needs to be destroyed, the process is simple. The network is activated. An expert from the anti-cult ranks speaks on the radio. A journalist, either manipulated or ideologically aligned with Dvorkin's network, publishes a so-called exposé. One or two TV segments featuring an anti-cult agent, and that's it. A person or group is labeled. They are no longer regarded as citizens, but as non-humans, a burden on society. From there, anything becomes permissible, being fired from a job, having children taken away, or being declared an extremist. Members of the anti-cult network systematically issue quote-unquote expert commentaries in mass media about the same religious or social groups, civic associations, or political parties, creating lasting negative images in the public mind. Their statements are marked by a uniform rhetoric and narrative, indicating centralized ideological coordination, not independent analysis. This isn't expert debate. It's a well-oiled stigmatization campaign. And what platforms do anti-cultists use to spread their destructive rhetoric to the masses? Typically, they rely on media outlets with significant reach, including those funded by USAID, and the network of foundations linked to George Soros, known as the Open Society Foundations, as well as anti-cult organizations like FECRIS that receives funding from a European state. All of it is framed under the banner of the so-called human rights and the fight for democracy. But in reality, what's being funded is a network system of mass manipulation and dehumanization. Everything unfolds just like, according to eyewitnesses, Jakub Jahl in Africa paid someone to go and beat up a specific target. Representatives of anti-cultism operate in the information space in the same way. They use corrupt journalists to destroy someone through information terrorism. In exactly this way, Dvorkin and his international criminal network managed to manipulate nearly the entire Open Society Foundation's network. By funding media outlets affiliated with Dvorkin's network, Soros' structure, perhaps unknowingly, ended up funding the dismantling of democracy and enabling Dvorkin to achieve his objectives. It appears that George Soros himself may have been unaware of how his resources were being used. As for USAID, which according to some reports has also been involved in funding media outlets that provide a platform for spreading Dvorkin's destructive rhetoric, via his active cult fighters. The conclusion is stark. It turns out that American taxpayers were actually financing information terrorism aimed at undermining democracy. In addition to that, European taxpayers were simultaneously funding the destruction of Europe itself. If we again highlight that one of the most active anti-cult organizations in Dvorkin's network, FECRIS, received funding directly from the French government. After all, even based on the resolution on the 8th review of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, adopted by the UN General Assembly on June 22, 2023, the actions, methods, and practices of members of anti-cult organizations and their accomplices fall under definitions of terrorism. We have to face the truth. Dvorkin's adherents are sadists who have perfected the art of manipulating human consciousness. At the core of their operations is always the same formula: lies, distortion of facts, and psychological programming of the public to serve their agenda. Just like that, while in Africa, Jahl pieced together a carefully constructed puzzle of lies to make Europeans unwittingly finance his crimes. His stay on the African continent served merely as a cover for an operation centered on perfecting anti-cult mind control techniques. Exploiting the poverty and social isolation of the region, he effectively refined his manipulative methods in a live environment, a kind of field testing ground. He incited internal conflict within communities. He cultivated a cult of his own supposed superiority. However, local residents saw for themselves how Jahl sowed division, tore their community apart from the inside, and was building a system of power around hatred and deception. This wasn't mere control, it was experimentation. He implanted destructive narratives. He even turned people against their own faith and traditions, imposing his own ideology onto them. And here, Quite clearly, we see the testing ground for the same methods he was evidently introduced to through Dvorkin's anti-cult organization. And when the lies were fully exposed and people began to understand where it was all heading, Jakub fled Africa. His experiment on a small Tanzanian community had ended. But he didn't return to Europe as a disgraced criminal. He came back as a confident manipulator, having fine-tuned every tool of psychological influence. Now, his testing ground was no longer a remote village, nor even a single country, but all of European society. As soon as he returned, he immediately resumed anti-cult activities and brought in his associate, Martin Siko, a police academy student who had been complicit in his crimes in Tanzania. Jahl's first target was the very people who had worked with him in Africa, including volunteers like Tatiana, who had genuinely helped local children in the same Tanzanian town. When back in Europe, Jahl launched smear campaigns against her and other people, accusing them of fraud and other fabricated crimes. He weaponized social media, engaged in media-driven dehumanization, and activated other anti-cult operatives. Right here, in front of everyone, he applied the same methods, the same rhetoric, and the same toxic mix of neurolinguistic programming, Nazism, and cruelty. That's exactly how Dvorkin's entire network with its extremist and terrorist ideology operates, using covert techniques of manipulating both the conscious and the subconscious minds. Anti-cult activity is just a facade, a cover for advancing much broader and more sinister goals. Every agent within Dvorkin's network isn't merely an ideological foot soldier in his army. They are tools used to advance his own personal power. If we were to give a proper legal classification to this transnational anti-cult network, whose representatives, including Jakub, Kremenovska, and Svitogor, are waging a covert yet devastating war against humanity, we would find that their coordination is not based on formal contracts, but on a shared criminal ideology, a common goal, and synchronized operations. However, it's important to recognize that this structure contains internal tiers. There are individuals like Jakub, rabid attack dogs, maniacs, and sociopaths. Within Dvorkin's anti-cult apparatus, they have a specific function: to foam at the mouth and viciously assault various religious and non-religious organizations, individuals, and even politicians on command. No one trusts them with serious work, of course. Their role is to terrorize and attack whoever the master points to. Take a step back and think. The representatives of this network only go after those who appear on Dvorkin's list. The behavior of such convenient enforcers like Jahl reveals a criminal psychological pattern: sadistic pleasure taken in the humiliation and suffering of other people, all under the mask of a supposed ideological mission. They don't need to understand the broader goal. They only need permission to attack. It's a pack-hunting dynamic, pure and simple. And as we know, a dog's only loyalty is to the one who feeds it. The one who doles out meat is the one who decides who gets mauled. In this case, Dvorkin is the ideological butcher. He throws human targets, entire communities, religious movements, businesses, and influential political figures into the pen for his dogs to tear apart. Not because they are fighting dangerous elements, but because violence is their only source of stimulation. These are creatures starved for power, control, and domination. Sociopaths on short leashes, known to the public under the euphemism anti-cultists. They don't need anything to be explained to them. Just give them a victim, mark the target, and they're already howling with anticipation. For these sadists, what matters is seeing pain in people's eyes. From time to time, they are granted the pleasure wallowing in the bloodied puddle of public terror. That's their nourishment. They're allowed to play the game of public shaming and ecstatically rip into the victim live on air, calling it fighting cults and protecting society. Once the public becomes desensitized to this spectacle, the next phase of the power grab begins. A command is issued to attack a party, a politician, or a president. Anyone who currently interferes with the master's desired course of events. But beyond these rabid dogs, there's a second tier, far more dangerous. Those are not leash-bound mutts. Those are architects, the intellectual conductors. They sit in universities, on theology faculties, on expert panels for religious assessments, in government think tanks, and influential media outlets. Sometimes they bear professor titles, sometimes national honors. Their task isn't to bark. Their task is ideological programming. They are the ones who write books, give lectures, publish their academic papers, and provide expert opinions, and commentaries later cited by the entire anti-cult network. It is they who coined the terminology that investigators, ministers, and even presidents later adopt. There are very few of them, maybe one or two per country. No more are needed. Their work is to inject a concept or a model. And then, like in a laboratory, the virus spreads everywhere, infecting discourse, infecting bureaucrats and vocabulary. They know precisely what they are doing, write destructive cult or dangerous sect into a manual, and soon everyone will be parroting it like a mantra, understanding neither the meaning nor the purpose, but following orders all the same. Some might call them gray mice, and they would be right, if those mice didn't know how to whisper in ways that reach the very top. It is these people who lay the mines beneath institutional stability. They pit elites against one another, erode trust, and slowly, methodically bring society to the brink of internal collapse. So when the news repeats phrases like, a religious organization poses a threat to national security, understand, these are not the minister's words. That's a planted phrase inserted by one of those honored experts, bound with fecal initiation by Dvorkin. But to be fair, not everyone who studies new religious movements is infected with this putrid fecal ideology. For example, in the Czech Republic, there are notable exceptions. One of them is Zdeněk Vodeček, a doctor of philosophy and religious studies. He is someone who can and should be called a credit to his country. He doesn't manipulate public opinion. He actually studies religious movements. Recently, on his media platform, he published an article by another author that clearly reflects his own stance on the word cult. For him, it's not an academic term. It's a label, a weaponized word used to pin anything on someone who is supposed to be destroyed. For this very reason, he hasn't surrendered to Dvorkin's obscurantism because he has openly spoken about it in defense of religious minorities, and anti-cultists hate him, especially people like Jakub Jahl. Vodeček once did the unthinkable in the eyes of the anti-cult network. He stood on the side of the law and science. He defended the religious rights of Jehovah's Witnesses, a group whose activity was banned in Russia on the grounds that defy both legal logic and common sense. Jahl couldn't forgive him for that. He continues to spread venom against Vodacek, portraying a respected scholar as an enemy of society. Because in Jahl's moral universe, and in that of the entire anti-cult network, an enemy is anyone who refuses to support their witch hunt against innocent people. As is often noted in articles on Vodacek's media portal, the word cult isn't a definition. It's an act of power. It's a brand used to destroy people without a trial, a dangerous linguistic gas chamber that triggers moral panic, erases reality, and replaces it with symbols of fear. This is actually why real scholars abandoned the term long ago, unlike Dvorkin's anti-cult activists, because the latter aren't looking for analysis, they are looking for a weapon. And if we trace this ideological lineage, it becomes clear that today's anti-cult agents in Dvorkin's totalitarian network have inherited that weapon directly from those who shaped the ideology of the Third Reich. It is worth recalling that the origins of this destructive, anti-human ideology go back to the 1930s when Protestant pastor Walter Künneth became head of the Apologetic Center in Germany. That center didn't merely monitor religious movements, it actively collaborated with the Gestapo, handing over archives and data on so-called unreliable groups. And what was the result of compiling those blacklists? Persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, many other minor religious and undesirable groups, and the Jewish people. In the final outcome, gas chambers and death camps. After the war, Künneth faced no accountability. On the contrary, he became a professor of theology and was decorated with national honors. His work was continued by another pastor, Friedrich Wilhelm Hack, who openly opposed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He revived the anti-sect apparatus in Bavaria and reinstated the blacklists of disfavored groups. From Hack, the legacy passed on to Johannes Agard, and from him to Alexander Dvorkin, who based today's anti-cult network, with its extremist and terrorist ideology, on the methods of Nazi mentors. All of these figures, Künneth, Hack, Agard, and Dvorkin, are connected not only methodologically, but also ideologically. The same pattern repeats: labeling, compiling blacklists, coordinating with law enforcement, and spreading hostility throughout society. If in the 1930s Gestapo openly used the Apologetic Center's databases to track down dissenters, today the center, in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons, under Dvorkin's leadership, does the same, handing over expert opinions to the FSB and to the Expert Council under the Ministry of Justice, which Dvorkin has chaired since 2009. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect isn't even the ideological succession. Open sources report that Hitler had a perversion, coprophilia. And similar claims have surfaced online regarding Alexander Dvorkin. This fact alone speaks volumes, doesn't it? In reality, judging by his public appearances, Dvorkin quite plainly seems to enjoy it when people discuss his persona in terms of his influence on the whole world. Just watch this excerpt.
Такого человека не было на Земле 1500 лет.
1500 лет не было равного ему на Земле. Он пример того, что и один человек способен изменить мир. И сейчас все говорит о том, что у него есть все шансы построить тот мир, к которому он стремится. Дворкин — это не просто человек. Это живой гений социальной инженерии и глобальной манипуляции, который способен перекраивать реальность, не выходя из тени кабинета. Да, гений, но гений, направленный на разрушение. Настоящий доктор зло. Ведь именно он сейчас поставил весь мир на грани. И именно от него зависит, случится это или нет.
Дворкин, неожиданно, да? Некоторые из вас первый раз вообще слышат его фамилию, а те, кто смотрел мои ролики раньше, писали мне, что я говорю какую-то ерунду, откуда он вообще взялся. Посмотрите это видео, а лучше еще почитайте вот эту статью, в которой говорится о том, как Дворкину удалось раскинуть целую сеть, не только по России, которую он уже подбрал под себя, а по всему миру.
В общем, вот, да. И, несколько картинок.
Такого человека.
Да.
Jakub Jahl. Based on all available testimonies, documents, and open source information, it is clear that he, too, is a representative of the organized transnational criminal anti-cult group in Europe, whose atrocities I've already detailed in today's video. Following the same model, he uses the status of cult expert to gain the trust of mass media and, apparently, law enforcement. At the same time, judging by his actions in Africa, he hones his anti-cult psychological manipulation techniques on impoverished communities, committing financial fraud on a national scale, and most horrifyingly, engaging in sexual exploitation of minors. And Jahl shows no remorse whatsoever. At first glance, this seems paradoxical. How can he feel no guilt? But in fact, it's not paradoxical at all. There is an explanation. Within the ideology of anti-cultism, violence against others, seen as inferior people and lesser beings, is considered normal. According to the anti-cult ideology, cult and sect experts and anti-cultists, including Dvorkin, Jahl, Krymenovska, and a number of other European and international anti-cult experts, see themselves as a higher caste. Based on their ideology, they have the right to do anything they want. They believe they have a right to exert any violence, psychological or physical, against people of the lower sort, against those they identify as others, people of another religion, nationality, or ethnicity. Anti-cultists view themselves as a superior class, entitled to exploit, humiliate, break people, inflict pain, and feel no remorse whatsoever. From the stories of Jahl's witnesses and victims, it is evident how he displays his contempt for Africans, while at the same time mocking the, quote, stupid white people who send him money. This reveals his self-image as a superior being compared to lesser others. He doesn't hide his contempt. He displays it as normal. And that's not merely his individual pathology, it's a systemic mindset. It is the anti-cult doctrine inherent in all of its adherents. This ideology of superiority over others is nothing other than Nazism. And it is precisely this destructive anti-cult doctrine that they seek to integrate into government apparatuses and then impose globally under the guise of fighting cults and sects. In reality, it's a war on dissent. It's an ideology where crimes become a virtue if it is directed against a wrong person. And if we allow this ideology to become part of global policy, the consequences will be irreversible. History has already shown what happens when anti-cult rhetoric is elevated to national ideology. In Nazi Germany, Kunith's methods became tools of repression. Groups branded as a threat to society were exterminated, from Jehovah's Witnesses to the Jewish people. The same logic implanted by Dvorkin is applied in China today. Branding Falun Gong as a cult became the legal pretext for mass repression, torture, and organ harvesting from living people. Anti-cult technologies are used as weapons of hybrid warfare to undermine democracy, destroy civil society, and establish ideological control. The anti-cult axis built around Dvorkin's network is not a local phenomenon, but a systemic threat to international security because the strategic goal of the anti-cult network is nothing less than subversion of statehood. Inciting hatred is not the end goal. It's a key method for implementing a much larger criminal intent directed against the very foundations of statehood. Their actions are not merely extremism, they are a precise technology of political destabilization. Their aim is to establish an ideological monopoly, to reach a position where the anti-cult doctrine is recognized as the only correct one at the national level. Yet, their ultimate goal is power. Representatives of the criminal anti-cult network seek to occupy positions as system-level experts within government and international institutions. Their goal is not to participate in public debate, but to monopolize interpretation of such concepts as religion, threat, extremism, security, and norm, and impose their own ideological agenda on society. This is a seizure of the regulatory apparatus, where they alone determine what is permissible and what must be excluded from the legal and cultural sphere.
What is particularly alarming is that among those seeking expert status are individuals such as Jakub Jahl,
already credibly accused of heinous crimes ranging from sexual violence to financial fraud. Nevertheless, these individuals attempt to use the title of experts to attain immunity, and a tool to extend their influence and institutionalize the expansion of their inhumane ideology. Psycholinguistically, the rhetoric of the anti-cult actors is constructed on the principle of normative inversion. They erase the line between evil and acceptable, between truth and manipulation. This is the essence of cognitive aggression, implanting destructive attitudes into public consciousness while presenting them as rational norms. In such a system, an individual is stripped of the right to critical thought, while humanistic values are replaced with distorted constructs where even cruel crimes may be justified as serving a higher purpose. Think about where this leads to. If figures like Jahl are allowed to shape public opinion through mass media, educational programs, and legal expertise, they are in effect rewriting the moral code of society. If for Jahl, as a typical representative of the anti-cult ideology, it is normal to rape children, cut them with knives, and force them to defecate into his mouth, then he will definitely seek to normalize such abuses and even codify them into government-sanctioned norms. Are we, as a civilized society, prepared to accept that? Are we willing to allow these very people to decide what our children will be taught? Which ideologies are permissible? And which organizations are allowed to exist? No way. This is why granting any representative of the anti-cult movement access to expert, legislative, governmental, or media roles must be regarded exclusively as a threat to public security. Today, both in Europe and the United States increasingly recognize the true nature of the Russia-orchestrated anti-cult ideology and are actively resisting it. International investigations are underway, legal assessments are being made, and sanctions are being developed. More and more jurisdictions are acknowledging that the activities of Dvorkin's anti-cult network and its agents constitute systematic abuses of rights that clearly fall under Article 17 of the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR. Let's recall, Article 17 of the ECHR prohibits abusing any right, including freedom of expression, for the purpose of suppressing or infringing on other rights and freedoms, such as freedom of conscience, belief, and religion. And that's exactly the mechanism used by the anti-cult network. It twists freedom of speech into a weapon to suppress and assault fundamental freedoms. Therefore, it is no longer necessary to prove what is obvious. Their activities are legally indefensible as free speech because this is a transnational criminal conspiracy exhibiting clear traits of ideological extremism. The anti-cult network systematically undermines the rule of law, disguising radical and repressive practices as expert activities. Fabrications, public opinion manipulation, falsified criminal cases, and perversion of legal definitions are all done with a single goal: to dismantle human rights under the guise of protecting them. Naturally, this demands an appropriate legal response in the name of national security and protection of constitutional rights in affected countries. And the international community is already responding. This is no longer a matter of warnings, but of legal consequences. As stated on May 21st and 22nd at the Civil Society Congress in Washington, D.C., hosted by the Catholic University of America, the process of imposing personal international sanctions and initiating criminal prosecution against anti-cult network representatives is already in an active phase of development. This announcement was delivered in the presence of high-ranking U.S. officials and representatives of the State Department. The forum gathered leading international experts, diplomats, and representatives of the world's religious communities. It concluded with a call for an international investigation, global sanctions, and criminal prosecution against members of the anti-cult network, which is identified as a tool of hybrid warfare aimed at undermining democracy and destroying the foundations of human rights around the world. The measures include asset freezing, bans on entry to democratic countries, and international legal isolation of all those involved, regardless of their positions or status. Currently, the actions of anti-cult network participants are already being reviewed and classified as involvement in transnational criminal conspiracy.
Kromě toho jsou v jejich jednání identifikovány znaky těchto trestných činů.
In addition, they are being associated with criminal offenses such as treason, involvement in an organized criminal group under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, incitement to hatred, obstruction of justice, abuse of official authority, and provision of fraudulent expert opinions. An international mechanism is being developed to challenge and review court decisions that were fabricated with the involvement of anti-cult network representatives.
Cílem tohoto mechanismu je obnovení
The purpose of this mechanism is to restore the rights of individuals who were unlawfully convicted based on biased, falsified, or legally invalid expert opinions, and to hold accountable all those involved in such violations, including anti-cult experts, prosecutors, judges, and all other officials. Their actions are viewed as part of the transnational criminal conspiracy carried out in the interest of the destructive anti-cult ideology that violates fundamental principles of international law and human rights. This approach allows for the steps aimed at the international prosecution of such individuals, as well as the possibility of initiating sanctions, up to and including the imposition of restrictive measures against countries that refuse to cooperate with international legal bodies or shelter those involved in fabrications, or continue to protect individuals implicated in this international criminal conspiracy and acting in the interest of Dvorkin's anti-cult network. Sanctions may be applied in cases where a state refuses to extradite the defendants for international justice or ignores demands to review court rulings issued by clear signs of illegality. Ask yourselves honestly, do you want to live in a truly democratic, free, and safe society? A society where your children and the children of your neighbors grow up with open hearts, not under the influence of those who teach manipulation, break people's will, and destroy lives. Would you want someone like Dvorkin to have access to your child's mind, shaping them into the next Jakub Jahl who, according to his victims' own testimonies, was a rapist and a sadist, whose atrocities are now spoken of with horror? Would you want your child to fall victim to a pedophile like that? If you don't want this to happen, don't turn away from everything you've heard today. For many families, this is already a tragic reality. And we're not just talking about children who have become victims. We're talking about future lives that could be crippled by the crimes of individuals involved in the anti-cult network if we remain silent today. Our children deserve not fear, but a future. And that future begins with our courage to speak the truth and to speak it loudly.